Okay, very good. Okay, well, everybody, hello again. I think most of you know who I am. Most of you know I do my volunteer work up at the Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge, which is not too far from here. And thought it would be interesting tonight to examine the history and mission of the refuge and the National Wildlife Refuge System, of which Iroquois is a part. All right, what I'm giving you here is just kind of a rough idea of the extent of the refuge system and where all the refuges are. Now, it's pretty apparent from the map that we are concentrated along the flyways, but we have a refuge at least one refuge in every one of the 50 states and in our 5 territories. What's remarkable in the last few years is we've added several 100 million acres of submerged lands. And most of that is out in the Pacific around the Marianas and Hawaii. One such national marine monument that's not shown here is off the New England coast, the Atlantic Marine Canyon Monument. But those lands have been added in an attempt to save particular submarine habitats that have shown themselves to be necessary for preserving some good biodiversity. All right, now the refuges themselves are run by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Now they're a bureau, they're a subset of the Department of Interior. It's a federal agency, cabinet level. Their other sub-agencies in there are the Park Service, the Ecological Services, which runs the T&E species designations. There's a law enforcement arm, and there are a few other cats and dogs in there. But mostly the interior agencies are those branches of the agency of Department of Interior that are charged with conserving, protecting, and enhancing the habitats and the animals and plants that use those habitats. And conservation is really the watchword there, because it's not just conserved for the point of conserving as a sanctuary might be, but it is conserved for the continuing benefit of the American people. A couple just notes: Forest Service does not work for Interior. They work for Department of Agriculture, so they're more into the commercial end of things, you know, making forestry a going commercial concern. We talked a little bit about the differences when I did forest inventory a few months ago. The National Marine Fisheries Service, which has threatened and endangered species jurisdiction over a lot of marine species, does not work for Interior either. They work for Commerce. So they're in there with NOAA and the weather people. EPA really doesn't come into this equation much. I list them here simply because they are a power in the environmental world, and they do sometimes have a say or a seat at the table, particularly where wetlands are concerned. You know, what's a wetland, what's not. They don't work for any particular department. They're the co-equal of the cabinet department, but they're an independent agency. Just a word about a multiple use agency or multiple sustained use. You may hear that phrase from time to time. Interior is not such a department. Their agencies are not multiple use agencies. Multiple use is hard. You got to be everything for everybody. And it's challenging. It's had mixed results. I mean, if you can imagine, you're trying to manage land. You got the Buffalo Bummers off-road biking people coming up one side of the hill, and you got the Batavia Butterfly Association coming up the other. When they meet at the top of the hill, it isn't going to go well. And multiple use agency has got to accommodate both of those groups. They've got to accommodate everybody. Now, with Interior is a little different, and fish in particular is a little different in that they are concerned with conservation primarily. Everything, especially with the refuge system, everything that's done in that system and everything that's done on the refuges is done with an eye toward meeting that conservation goal. Okay, and that conservation objective brings us to the system itself. It evolved over time. It's like anything that has evolved through the federal government. It's complicated. You all know the definition of a camel. It's a horse designed by committee. Sometimes this looks like one. But at present, it's managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for various conservation purposes. And there are several of them that we're going to go through tonight. And it takes in an awful lot of stuff besides visitor outreach. Now, to do more than simply patrol that land, open the gates and sit and wait for things to happen, the Fish and Wildlife Service enjoys a set of very broad authorities to utilize volunteer services. At Iroquois, for example, where I volunteer, we've got 6 permanent billets. One of those is the refuge manager, and he shares time with Montezuma Refuge to the east of us and Erie Refuge to the west. So he's got 3 units of this system to work. And so he has to leave a lot of the day-to-day operations to the biologist and his refuge specialist. So the volunteers now do a lot of the routine tasks, whether it's manning the visitor center desk, we're doing some of the basic maintenance. We check the bird boxes. We got a lot of bluebird boxes up for our cavity nesters here. We check those. I've walked transects for data collection for the biologist. And things like that now, the volunteers do an awful lot of that and provided them to the refuge staff. The Fish and Wildlife Service also has the ability to partner with nonprofit, quasi-private organizations, usually known as the Friends of whatever refuge we're dealing with. So we have an organization called the Friends of the Iroquois Refuge. And they can do a lot of things that the agency and we as agency volunteers cannot do. They can solicit funds, they can fundraise, they can do minor construction projects that we would ordinarily not be able to handle as part of our budget. All right, just a few notes on the history of the system. I mentioned earlier, it's extremely complicated, and I'm not going to go through anything near all of them tonight, but these are just the highlights. We started in 1903. There was a great hoo-ha going on right about that time over the use of feathers and plumes for ladies' hats. And we were, at the time, basically eliminating entire flocks of birds to feed that market. Well, in Florida, there was one man, Paul Kreugel, who vowed to protect the birds on this particular little 5-acre island known as Pelican Island on the Atlantic side of Florida in Naples Bay. And he did so with a rowboat and a shotgun. And so the Audubon societies, both in Florida and in Massachusetts, led by a Boston socialite who made this a pet peeve of hers, finally we were able to get to President Teddy Roosevelt and impress on him that we were squandering our natural heritage and we needed to do something. Well, that kind of appealed to Teddy, so he just declared that Pelican Island would be a sanctuary for the wading birds and the pelicans that were there. And that was really the first time any land had been set aside and protected for the conservation of shorebirds and migratory birds. Over the next 10 years, it kind of caught on. And so by 1912, we had 51 units designated by executive order, and Congress had gotten in the act by that time and had designated 3 such units. Now, it didn't really go smoothly. There were a lot of complaints lodged by the fishermen that claimed that the pelicans were eating all their fish. There was a big investigation about that, and the upshot of it was, 120 years ago, we can look at it now and say, yeah, the upshot of it was they were overfishing, and that was indeed the conclusion of the investigation. So it wasn't the pelicans at all. But you can just imagine the politics that went on at the time. The wardens of these refuges or sanctuaries were funded by the local Audubon Society. They were not funded by Congress. That was because Congress had designated that many, and the president could only designate the unit. He could not authorize payment of somebody to staff it. So the Audubon Society took that on. The money ran out after a while, and one of the areas in the Everglades, when the wardens were let go, was absolutely trashed. There was a flock of birds down there and a rookery that just got completely destroyed. That started to get people's attention. A couple of the wardens of some of these sanctuaries, and Mr. Bradley in 1905 and Mr. McLeod in 1908, were actually killed in the line of duty defending their refuges. So after that kind of rocky start, the momentum for these refuges and the public outrage about squandering the resources, as well as all the violence that went on, became unstoppable, and the system really began to grow. The next major point in it was the 1929 Migratory Bird Conservation Act. Now, this authorized acquisition of land for use as an inviolate sanctuary or other management purposes for migratory birds. First time we've done that. And the, Chrissy, do I still have you? Okay.
It looks blank to me, Dave. Looks like a gray screen.
Better?
Oh, there you go. Yep, yeah. There you are.
Okay. That 1929 Migratory Bird Act is the authority that most of the refuges use even today. Iroquois was established in 1958, and its authorizing authority was this 1929 statute. 1934, Congress passed a Duck Act stamp to pay for acquisition of the property. And this is a little odd for the feds. Usually it's tax money, but here it was a user pays kind of philosophy, where if you wanted a license to hunt waterfowl, you bought a duck stamp, and they weren't cheap. And the funds from that were put into a trust fund that then paid for acquisition of the lands that make up a lot of the units of the refuge system. Now, we really don't need to get the duck stamp acts now if one is interested in hunting waterfowl. However, you can still buy them. They're very nice paintings, actually. And the money from the proceeds from that do go still, even today, go into acquiring property for designation as a wildlife refuge. 1966, we had the first recognition of the entire inventory of refuges as a comprehensive system, and we expanded it to the protection of fish and wildlife that were threatened or endangered, and to wildlife management areas and waterfowl production areas. All this was new. This was more of a little bit more active role for the refuges. And in '97, the system came into how we see it today, pretty much in its present form. We have had a new overarching mission that augmented, it didn't replace, but it augmented any original authorizing mission and legislation. And it directed Interior to manage the refuge system as a national system. It establishes 6 priority recreational uses. We'll go through those. It strengthens the compatibility determination process for any use that the refuge managers go through. And I'll talk briefly to that. And it requires the service to complete a comprehensive conservation plan for its refuges on a 15-year cycle. So each refuge has to do that. And we'll talk a little bit about those. So first up, here's the mission, which is the National Wildlife Refuge Systems, to administer that national network for the conservation, management, and appropriate restoration of all our resources there for the benefit of present and future generations. So there's a lot in that mission statement. And as we go through the rest of the presentation tonight, I'm hopeful that we can unpack that a little bit. Now, one of the first things we do with this is look to land management, because that's essentially what in Fish and Wildlife is. It's a land, it is a land management agency. They pride themselves on being science-based, and they do a pretty good job of it. What that means in the field is that there are lots of surveys and lots of data and lots of study and lots of data calls that have to be answered and sent up. And what those do is inform the policy decisions taken at Big Fish and Big Interior. The rest of this slide here I've got broken out into budget lines, because it's just easier to think about it that way. The main taxpayer money that goes into this is for the operations and maintenance budget, and that entails the services that I've got listed there, the primary of which is the wildlife and habitat management one. Now, within that function, which is the major function that fish takes on these refuges, it's really the purpose the refuges exist at all, is for that wildlife and habitat management. We do habitat restoration and management, migratory bird management, T&E species management, invasive species control, pollinator habitat management, contaminant migration. We've got a lot of our refuges that are small and they're in urban areas. So if we've got the contaminant plume coming our way, that we get to take a part in shaping the remedy for that. And we are charged with addressing the effects of climate change, which is becoming an increasingly big deal, especially with some of the refuges out in the Northwest. This is not what they're used to. The visitor services handle the 6 priority uses. I'll talk about those in just a minute. And then we have the conservation planning is the other big one, and that is that 15-year cycle I talked about. The service also has its own law enforcement arm. At Iroquois, we have one law enforcement guy. He's there. That's what he does. And then, of course, there's maintenance. All of that is handled under the operations and maintenance budget, the O&M budget. Fire prevention and control is important at these refuges. We do a lot of our habitat management, particularly on grasslands. We do it using controlled burns. The biologist tells me the reason for that is that grasses are used to, they kind of like fire, they're used to it. They go through fire cycles in the wild, and this is a way that we can manage our grassland habitats and keep them from going into shrubs and not completely destroy them. Roads and trails are their own. For the major roads, we have to work with our highway departments. The construction is its own appropriation. Land acquisition is some tax money, but mostly duck stamps, as I mentioned before. All right, after habitat or wildlife and habitat management, we have the visitor services, and the 6 wildlife dependent priority uses that are set statutorily. They were set in 1997 by the Improvement Act, are what I lay out here. You know, wildlife observation, photography, environmental education, interpretation, hunting, and fishing. The pie chart I give you here is a snapshot of over the entire refuge system of where the visitor services fell in which one of those 6 priority uses they fell. And you can see that between the educational programs and the observation programs, to include photography, it's over 2/3. In fact, it's over 3/4 of the total amount of visits, and that's over 47 million visits. So that's pretty. That would be a pretty reliable breakout, I think. There are non-priority uses. These are the ones that we would require a special use application that comes to the refuge manager. He makes sure it complies with the fish wildlife policies, and then it's his discretion, based largely on whether the requested use is going to be compatible with his conservation mission. So that's, you know, my refuge manager has been very firm that he's not a multiple use organization. His brief is conservation, and anything that can help him do that, he'll consider. All right, now, so we get a question from time to time is why do we do so much management? Why not, well, if we've identified these refuges, why don't we just let nature do its thing? Well, a lot of the refuges are under 20,000 acres. And when you pull back, go at a very high altitude and look down, that kind of plot of land is really just a postage stamp in the grand scheme of things. So we can't rely on nature to give us our fire cycles and stuff to break up the different habitats and keep that cycle going. We've kind of got to manage it in microcosm within the footprint of the lands we have. All right, on the comprehensive conservation plans, this is the 15-year cyclic plans that the refuges must now do. They are a full-blown environmental impact statement, which is probably a very good thing because we include that we would have to have done one anyway. We can include all of the required stuff like coastal consistency and historic preservation issues if there are any. We can deal with TNE species designations in there. We can also, we put this document, when we finish it, we put it out in draft for comment. We take the comments from the public and we respond to those comments. They maybe not be in the way the public likes, but we are duty bound to respond to them and give them our justification or our ration or reasoning for why we're choosing to do what we are choosing to do in it. And then after that, we go to a final, and that becomes the plan that we follow for the next 15 years or so until we review it, renew it, and be sure that it doesn't go stale on us. I say here it is the main planning document, and I think that's right, but there are a lot of step-down documents that are used more in a day-to-day sense. There's a habitat management plan, there's a water management plan, there's a wildlife plan, there's a visitor services plan, and so on, all the way down, that all spin off of this big main comprehensive conservation plan that we use. An appendix to this plan is also all the compatibility determinations. Now, if we get a special use request come in, like we get somebody who's got a disability, wants to bring his car onto the refuge down to a photo blind where he can take pictures, or down to a hunting blind if he wants to hunt waterfowl during season, and assuming he's got his license and everything else. That's the sort of special use that we would consider, and if we can accommodate him within the conservation mission, we would go ahead and allow it. If for some reason we would have to limit it in any way or deny it, that rationale would have to be spelled out in the determination. Now, we also do determinations on, do we have any wilderness areas? Do we have any where nobody goes? Do we have any national natural landmarks? Well, Iroquois has one, and I'll talk to that in a bit. Do we have any natural research areas? Iroquois has one, where the habitat is an example of something we want to keep tabs on so we know how it works and how it functions. We have about a 15-acre plot that serves as one of those. The compatibility determinations on whether we use the refuge for those purposes, for designating a wilderness, or it's going to be a national landmark or something like that, that is also tagged into these big comprehensive plans as an appendix. Okay, that is an overview, very quick and very fast here, of the overall refuge system itself. I've run through your history a little bit. I've given you some idea of what the different programs are, and I think you can see by now that the visitor services piece of it it's a significant part, it's a large part, but it's by no means the major part, and it's only a little bit of what these staffs do. So what I want to do now is shift over to my refuge up at Iroquois and talk to you a little bit about what we do up there to further both the wildlife and habitat management and the visitor services programs of it. And I tell you, I don't know who took this picture of the bald eagle, whether he was at our refuge or whether it's someplace else. But I have seen that shot live, standing outside the visitor center at Iroquois. A couple winters ago, I had a fellow look just like that, looking at me just like that, coming at us from across the road. It got your attention. Okay, now to implement the wildlife and wildlife and habitat management function, along with the conservation planning function, and the visitor services function, the refuges will set out goals on how they're going to get there. We have 6 of them at Iroquois, and I've given you the first 3 here. Now, if you read through them quickly, you'll see that these are all more on habitat management, wildlife management, and the kind of things that we want to do to maintain the habitats, maintain the land. So we want to provide that high quality freshwater, wetland, stopover and breeding habitat for the waterfowl and the marsh birds. We want to, and we're going to do that through water impoundments and water flow control. We want to maintain the integrity of Oak Orchard Creek. That's where we have our national natural landmark. It's a little piece of the creek there that is completely pristine, hasn't been touched. It's just the creek and its floodplain with bottomland forest and the wetland shrub border to it. Third, they want to provide the diverse mix of grasses and shrubland for the reasons I mentioned earlier. Part of the mission here is to maintain the biological integrity of all these habitats. So to do that, you've got to have a habitat that is self-sustaining, that's stable, and that's got everybody, it's got all the niches it needs, it's got everybody in one of those niches. So to do that, we sometimes have to really intensively manage our water levels or our shrublands and grasslands to be sure that we don't lose them through a natural succession. Now, in the west part of the refuge is where most of our water impoundments are, and that's where we do most of our water management. That's where we have most of our emergent marsh. We have wooded wetland over there, but we also have wooded wetland over on the east side. And with the east side, we're kind of leaving to its own devices. We don't manage that quite as much. Now, in habitat management here, I give you the 6 major habitats that we have with a rough acreage for each and a little squib on either what it is or how we control it. I mentioned the control burns with a fire cycle. That's what we do with our grasslands. We've got quite a few of those. And I didn't get to participate in one. They don't much like volunteers getting close to those, probably for good reason. But I was able to watch it while I was doing my other work out there a couple years ago. When the burn first goes through, the place looks like the wrath of God for about 3 or 4 days. After that, the grass comes back. And in a month, you never know it's been hit. In fact, it looks a lot better. What that does is control the shrubbery and prevents that succession from grassland or a meadow into a shrub and a forest. We select both warm and cool weather grasses, so we have a mix, and that's very good habitat for those communities of critters, the birds and the small mammals that use a grassland and that hunt in a grassland. Now, shrublands are periodically raised to prevent a succession of forest growth. There's an invasive issue with those because some of the honeysuckles we have and the autumn olive we have here are very vigorous. They're very complete in their own canopy. Instead of being 80 feet off the ground, it's more like 10. And I've heard some foresters are concerned that a shrub, if a shrubland gets going for too long, you could end up with a new kind of forest with a canopy that's 10 feet off the ground and nothing can get through it. Fortunately, we're not at that stage yet, but we do periodically take those shrublands down to the ground to let them to let them come back, and also to give an occasional tree or two the ability to poke through and kind of knock the sunlight down to keep them under control. All right, on to wildlife management. That's talk about habitat management. Now we're into wildlife management. One of the, and this spills over into visitor services a lot, but right now I'm in the management part of it. We do a lot of stuff with migratory birds, as you might imagine. One of the things we're very happy about is the purple martin research and banding that we do. We had a graduate student at UB who did her research out at Iroquois on nesting behavior of the martins, and she's since taken a professorship at UB and brings her graduate students out. So now we're banding the martins, we're putting little radio transmitters on them. We want to see when they leave the net, when they fledge, where they go, how they feed, how far they go. And when they migrate, do they leave with the rest of the flock, or do they leave later? Do they leave earlier? When they get down into the Gulf on their way to South America, do they hug the coast, which seems to be what they do, or do they just go straight across, take a turn of Cuba and keep on going? We've had some interesting results on it already, is that once the birds fledge, they tend to leave the area, which is surprising because the martins are very communal birds, and they're very geographically loyal, I think is the term I've heard. They will come back to the same colony over and over and over and over again, as long as that colony is suitable for them. One of our members here is working on kestrel reintroduction to try to bring them back to the refuge. I've been working with him since he's the licensed bander for bluebirds and tree swallows. I've been working with him on helping to check those boxes and occasionally helping him band these birds this summer. We do a lot, we coordinate with just about every bird organization in Western New York. And we've worked with DEC and other nonprofits on bat counts as well. So the main point of this whole slide, though, is that bottom picture with a little girl holding a newly fledged purple martin for the first time she's ever held any bird in her hand, probably. Now you can't get better than that for getting getting an appreciation of the outside and for the natural world to these children. So we made this, of one of the banding days, we made that in interpretive program opportunity. So folks could come and see what we do and see how we do it, have the professor and her students explain it, and then give the children the chance to see up close just what it is we do. All right, now as we go through with the habitat and wildlife management, a lot of inventories and surveys that we have to do. I've talked to you a little bit about forest inventories. I've done waterfowl vegetation inventories. I've done pollinator meadow growth inventories. I've done invasive species work with some of the staff there. I've also checked into the nesting rookery that we have for the wading birds, the egrets and the herons. And that, the work on that took all of an hour. We about 5 of us lined up and just walked through the rookery, pivoted, walked back with a counter so we could count the number of nests in our particular lane. But a lot of this kind of work that goes on is something that occupies the biologist. He's got to prepare it, he's got to keep the records, he's got to file the reports and everything like that. And things like a forest inventory or waterfowl vegetation report that he's got to do, these things take time. And if we volunteers can get out in the field and do the transects for him, do the data collection for him, that's a huge help to him. All right, now as far as the land management itself is concerned, I've talked a little bit about water levels. What I'm showing here at the top is one of the main waterways that we have. It's a ditch, and originally transferred water from Tonawanda Creek up to the Erie Canal, which, by the way, is not in the Tonawanda watershed at this point. It's in the Eau Gorge watershed. So the hydrology runs north, and to control water levels in the various impoundments, we put in a bunch of dikes to isolate the impoundments. Then we have water control structures put in. That's what that second picture is. Big old, it's dirt simple, big old vertical tube goes down with pipes leading where the water comes from and where the water is going to. And what you do to change water levels in the various impoundment is you put slats in there so that the water will back up and won't move through until it spills over the top. So you can keep different water levels that way. Now on a 3 to 6 year program, we will sometimes drain entire impoundments, let them look like mud flats for a bit. But really what we're doing is allowing the oxygen to get in there and allowing the subaqueous vegetation that is typical of an emergent marsh. We let that germinate and grow. We did that with one of the pools near one of the trails this year. Looked like a mud flat that wasn't going anywhere in May, and now it's really quite a green meadow with a little bit of water coming back into it. So should be good for the waterfowl this fall. Talked about controlled burns. Farming is a deal. Now farming, we sometimes will lease acreage out for hay. That's pretty much okay, because that allows us to keep it in a grassland province. By the time they collect, by the time the farmer gets out there to get the hay harvested, the critters that would use that grass are pretty much done. And so we're not going to disrupt their breeding or feeding activities all that much. For any other kind of monoculture though, like corn or soy or something like that, the issue becomes, by planting this crop, are we eliminating other food sources that these critters should like? And that's where we get into the conservation as the primary mission. Folks think that farming is nature. It isn't really, because corn by itself or soybeans by itself do not give these critters the energy they need, especially if they're neotropical migrants or waterfowl that have to migrate a long way. Okay, I've mentioned the natural landmark of Oak Orchard Creek. That third picture there is a shot of the first turn in the creek as you enter that area. The research natural area is a little 15-acre strip of hardwood. It's up on a ridge, and it's been there for about 150, 200 years. It's not old growth, it's secondary growth, but it's still old enough that it's a very stable miniature system up there, and it's something that we've designated that we want to keep an eye on and just see how it works, try to learn from it. Okay, the last three goals that Iroquois sets up, we've talked wildlife and habitat management. Now we're going to shift more into the public outreach kind of thing. If you look at these goals here, you'll see every one of them is aimed at getting refuge visitors to understand and appreciate what we do, getting hunters and anglers to enjoy and support programs that are going to provide a high quality experience for them and then enhance our partnerships. The point here is public support for anything the refuges do is absolutely imperative. Without public support, this whole system comes to the ground because we just couldn't sustain it. As it is, the interests that were pushing the conservation back as far back as 1903 and continue to push it today are a very diverse group of folks. They're the waterfowl hunters, they're the fishermen, they're the Audubon Society, they're the educators, they're all the nonprofits that are interested in bats or birds or what have you. So as all those interests get worked around and as all the our, our local neighbors take a look at what we're doing. You know, we have to be able to reach them and convince them what we're doing is a good thing. The best way to do that is we pay a lot of attention to the wildlife and habitat maintenance that I've talked about. And then when people come to the refuge, we show them what the result is. And that seems to work pretty well. We're on pretty good terms with the folks around us as far as their support, being supportive of the refuge. And we are in partnership with UB. We're in partnership with Canisius College. We've got in partnership with DEC for management and law enforcement of our lands and the adjacent state lands. We've got multiple nonprofits, most of which are in the migratory bird area, but some with bats, some with other critters that we work with on a routine basis. Now the visitor services thing we get, what I've got here first is a shot of the interior of the new visitor center. A lot of exhibits, a lot of hands-on stuff where the kids can listen to what it sounds like in an emergent marsh, or take out a pelt and see what belongs to the ermine, what belongs to the rabbit, and then look at the relative sizes and figure out who's going to win that fight. On the uses that are the priority uses, the wildlife dependent uses that the statute lists out, there are a lot of things that we do. We hold a fishing derby for them. We do archery workshops because we want people, if they're going to use a bow, we want them to know how to shoot it. You know, our Spring into Nature open house is kind of a wide variety of show and tell stuff. We bring raptor habilitators in so they can show off the birds. We have tree and leaf identification tables where the kids can play a game with it, or if they're interested in looking, we have the exhibits out there for them. We've made sunprints with stuff. They can, there's all kinds of things that they can do, and that open house is very, very widely attended. Besides that, we do observations, we do guided hikes, we do interpretive programs like I showed you with the purple martins and other stuff. We do that pretty much year round. But that's run pretty much through the Friends of the Refuge. That group of people puts that together, gets it approved by the refuge manager, and then they run it. Because the refuge, frankly, doesn't have the staff to do that kind of interpretive program and outreach. We do youth hunts and other hunting opportunities. Those hunting is a recognized priority recreational use. So if we can get the folks used to hunting appropriately and with an appreciation for the habitats they're in, sometimes they can be our best eyes and ears on the ground. If they see something that's not right, they'll come back and let us know. And I've already, I think, talked about non-priority stuff. A quick word on trapping. Trapping is not part of hunting. Trapping is not analyzed as a priority wildlife dependent use. It is analyzed as a tool that can be used for wildlife management. So that's something that we control very, very tightly. We do allow it. There's a long history of trapping in this part of the world. There's still a bit of a fur trade up here, and we do have a surfeit of some mammals. Muskrat and mink come to mind. So we do allow trapping of that, but we do charge for it, and it's very tightly controlled by the refuge staff. And with that, that's all I have for you. Just to refresh the purpose of the refuge system as a whole, it is management of the public lands for conservation purposes for the benefit of present and future generations. And I hope what I've been able to do tonight is kind of show you how we do that. So with that, I will entertain your questions, and as always, we'll try to answer them. If I can't, I'll try to get you an answer and get that back to you one way or another.
Thank you, Dave. Thanks again. Thanks. This is what, your third presentation you've given for us?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so I really appreciate it. And especially this time, somebody else was unable to fill their slot today and wasn't able to make it. And so Dave filled in with just a couple weeks notice. So I especially appreciate it tonight. And I'm very thankful. So I'm going to be selfish and kick it off with a question. You talked about the submerged habitats and the marine conservation areas. Are they typically delineated like from the shoreline to a certain GPS location, or how are they delineated?
Usually those marine monuments are, I don't think there's any hard and fast rule for whether they start at the high water mark or the low water mark. Mm-hmm. I think we're looking at resources out there. So it's what do we have? A really good coral reef? Do we have a whole area that's got a set of submarine canyons that are necessary for the for say beaked whales to use? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess I was wondering if it's delineated from the edge of the shoreline as climate change progresses and sea level rises. Does it, if it's delineated from the shoreline, then it could just continue to move with the shoreline. But if it's delineated, using GPS coordinates, then I could see that getting very interesting in the future.
Yes and yes. I think that is a concern, and I think it's a concern that's well known within big fish and big interior. That's and not so much even for the marine monuments. If the corals die and they move north, one presumes we could shift that boundary. Mm-hmm. One thing we run into with that is that you've got now, so these areas that are marine monuments, sometimes they're not within our territorial sea. They're way out there. Mm-hmm. And what we call our economic exclusion zone runs out about 200 miles. And in places like the Marianas, where it's an archipelago, I mean, you draw a line 200 miles around the outer islands, and everything inside it is considered part of the United States' economic exclusion zone, even though foreign vessels would have the right of free passage across it. They couldn't take the fish or something like that. Mm-hmm. Climate change is going to play havoc with that whole regime. That regime was very, very painfully crafted back in the 60s. Mm-hmm. And it's been very useful. It's been quite successful. It's to kind of put some controls on how we use the oceanic resources. But outside of those economic zones, the oceans are considered to be a global commons. And if any of you have either read a little article called The Tragedy of the Commons, that the hallmark of any common resource is that people overuse it because they all want to be sure they get their share out of it. And you end up really degrading the resource. So the territorial sea and the economic exclusion zone designations were critical. And they've been actually more successful than one would have thought. Now, what climate change is going to do and what moving the shoreline or disappearance of these islands is going to do, good question, Matt. I don't think anybody knows. But you've got a similar issue now with the shore-based, with the refuge units that are located, say, where Iroquois is, or in downtown Minneapolis, or even or especially the big ones up in Alaska that cover all the counties, some of them. As climate change moves, the species we're trying to protect are going to move or die out, depending on whether they're mobile at all. Forests aren't going to be able to move as fast as the climate is changing. So it's going to be some very stressful times, I think, for conservation as a whole and for all these creatures as a whole.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Caroline asks, can you tell us how your involvement with Iroquois evolved?
Well, short answer is I've always wanted to do for forestry work. I've always liked running around in the woods, basically. I used to tell my little brother that I was playing at being a Radagast, the wizard. But that love of the outdoors that was fostered by my father, fostered by my uncle, and who was, I would go down and work on my uncle's farm from time to time, and he would tell me about how some of the forest worked and what tree would do what and so on. And when we moved to New York, I found the Master Naturalist program, got into it. And being a former federal employee, the Fish and Wildlife Service was something that I was sort of familiar with. So I went and applied to be a volunteer with them, and they said, yes, please. We'd love to have you. So I've been there ever since.
I bet they did. You're a gem.
Well, thank you.
Lori Dittmer asks, she says, thanks, Dave. It's named Iroquois. Are there any Native American groups participating in programs?
Yes, we do. The local tribe up here, or local nation up here, are the Seneca. Specifically the Tonawanda branch, as opposed to the main Seneca branch down near Salamanca. But we have a couple of their elders do participate. One of them does an interpretive walk every year where he talks about how the Seneca Nation would identify and use some of the different plants and what they would, how they would treat with some of the different animals. The refuge itself has a lot of its features are named after the different Iroquois nations. You all know the Iroquois were a confederacy. There were 5, then 6 nations within that confederacy. And we have portions of the refuge are named after all but the Tuscarora. The Tuscarora were the latest. They came up from North Carolina, and they were allowed some of the Seneca lands over somewhere up in Niagara County. But the nation that occupied this particular area in the Alabama swamps were the Seneca Nation.
Okay. A couple of people asked if you could send out the, you could email the slides that have the list of statistics that you provided in the beginning.
Yeah, I can do that.
Okay. Terrific. Adrian.
Let's see it. Oh, well. Yeah, I'll get that. I'll get that out one way or another.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you. Adrian asks if you know, are there any national wildlife refuges that have been gained or lost in, say, the last 25 years? And what would cause a national wildlife refuge to lose their, quote, status?
You know, I'll have to research that because I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I've not heard of any refuge being disestablished. Mm-hmm. The mission may shift a bit, or the way we accomplish the mission may shift a bit, depending on what happens. The question's valid, though, because with climate change coming on, species are going to move, things are going to change. And I think it's only a matter of time before one or another refuges loses its purpose for being to something like climate change. It just takes that away.
Thank you. And then Kathy had a comment or observations about duck stamps. Kathy, do you want to unmute or share those questions?
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, okay. Please.
I've been a duck stamp collector since 1986 when my husband and I visited Ding Darling in Florida. And I now have a complete collection as of a couple of years ago from 1934, 1935 stamps, largely collected from visits to national wildlife refuges. The gift shops on the more touristy, or the ones who are accommodating to the tourists, often have donated stamps that are available for purchase. And I've been able to complete my collection with that, and with some eBay purchases. But it's just a wonderful way to support the system. And USPS.com/shop will give you access to this year's stamp, which came out in July. It's a lesser scalp. And also last year's stamp, which was the black-bellied whistling duck. It's a great collection, even for those who don't collect. It's just fun to do. So
I'm jealous. Yeah, I'm jealous. I've seen a few of those stamps, and then they are works of art. So
they're amazing.
For you. I'm glad you got your set.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have a couple of duck stamp prints, and they really are, the artists do really lovely work. Any other questions? I've reached the end of the list. Are there any last questions or comments? There are a lot of thank yous, a lot of appreciation.
Well, you're very welcome. This has been a fun. This was a fun one for me to do. So.
Good. Well, I'm glad that you could enjoy it as well. So thanks to everybody who joined. I know this is, the summertime, lots of people on vacation and whatnot. So I really appreciate you being here tonight. And we'll be back the second Monday in September. And so until then, please enjoy the rest of your summer, and hope to see you all again soon.
All right. Good night, all.
Dave.
Good night.